Hello, my sinners, and do you want to learn how to make eloquent, beautified, and dare I say, sexy thumbnails just like your favorite YouTubers? Are you tired of your thumbnails looking like the work of an old boomer using Microsoft Paint? Don't let your thumbnails look like they're addicted to meth on an episode of Cops. Stay tuned for my tutorial on using Photoshop to create high-quality thumbnails that will drive more engagement, more views, and more clicks, and upgrade the overall look and quality of your YouTube channel. Once you have Photoshop open, the first thing we're going to want to do is create a new file. The first thing you're going to want to do is set up the size of your template. For a YouTube thumbnail, we're going to want to set it at 1280 pixels wide by 720 pixels high. And if you want to make sure everything else is copied here like I have, I also recommend you save yourself a preset, so whenever you want to make a new YouTube thumbnail, you could just load that preset up. Once we hit create, we're going to be granted a nice white background. Now before we do anything else, we need a starting point for our thumbnail. So in this case, I'm going to choose the game Rust. But make sure, depending on what game you're playing, that you're choosing a background relevant to that title. And another tip, include HD in your search query so you're getting the highest quality images possible. Save the image to your desktop. Now you can also copy and paste it directly into Photoshop, but I recommend saving it in case you have to come back and make any changes later to avoid any issues with the file itself. Now you could simply drag the image over into the Photoshop canvas, and the image will keep its original size, in contrary to the file size you have set up for this YouTube thumbnail. So we're going to want to drag our edges and make sure that we're evened out, we have no white space and no dead space. And because we chose an HD background with a large file size, our quality isn't going to suffer much at all from stretching and elongating our picture. Now in a previous video I made regarding creating free thumbnails without using Photoshop, you want to make sure that you add some contrast to the photo. It creates an eye-popping dynamic. So to do that, simply just hit Ctrl-M. Now to create a bit of contrast without overdoing it, follow my cursor down to the bottom left square. We're going to adjust the linear path just a little bit down this way, and in the top right square we're going to adjust the path north. Once we hit the OK button, we're going to notice that our colors are a lot more lively, and the thumbnail overall just seems more surreal and eye-catching. Now before we add anything else, we're going to want to create some depth to the background. To do so, and with any change that you make going forward, make sure you select the new layer button down here in the bottom right. Now make sure you keep everything organized and simply double click the layer you want to rename. Rename it anything you'd like as long as you know what the layer is used for. And to add this depth effect, we're going to want to go over to our brush tool. We're going to want to make sure that white is selected as the color and that your brush hardness is set at 0. Make sure the size of your brush is big enough to cover the outside area of these edges, but not too big to be overwhelming and cover the entire image. Now, if you want to create the ray effect at the top of the page, which I suggest you do on your first try, allow the bottom of the circle to lap over the image and press down. Now, what I recommend you do is play around with the placement of your circle depending on the image that you use, and find the best areas of contrasting color that you could add more depth. Make sure only half of the circle or a quarter of the circle is overlapping the image itself, and simply press down. You could repeat this step along the edges of the photo, but I recommend keeping this effect as subtle as possible. So for this image, I'm going to keep my effect on the bottom and the top of the image, avoiding the sides. Now to add the coup de grace on this edge effect, we're going to create another layer, bring it down below the original edge light layer we had. We're going to come on over to the brush color palette and we're going to choose black. Now, repeating the process that I said before, we're going to create a shadow effect to add even more depth. Now, don't worry about overdoing it with the black too much. Let's shadow the sides and shadow down below, all the way up to the other side. We'll go over it a couple times here. And now to add the final touch to the shadow, let's go down to the layer style and change the opacity down to about between 40 and 50. Now let's repeat that process with the white area of the lighting, and you won't necessarily always have to do this with the white portion, usually not at all as if you're using a God ray effect just in the top middle portion of the image, but since we hit the top left and right quarters and the bottom baseline of the image, I want to make sure the opacity isn't too overbearing. We cut that down to about between 50 and 60 since it's obviously a little bit lighter than the black, and now we've got some pretty depth. Now we want to finally start adding in our text, so let's include another layer and drag it right below the edge light layer. Go over to your font tool, select anywhere on the palette because we could change this later, and I really recommend checking out duffont.com to find different fonts for different styles of your videos, but for this specific video we're going to be using Big Noodle Tilting. Now in the font block, type out some verbiage that's relevant to the title of your video and the context of the content. In this case, we're going to go ahead and call it Rust Trolling. Now to free transform a layer, you can easily go up to Edit Free Transform, or you can hit Ctrl T and readjust the size like so. Now let's italicize this bitch because it's going to look a lot more professional and more provocative. To do so, select your text and come right over here to the characters button. Select your slanted drunk T and it'll be italicized. It's a very good trick if you're trying to find font onto font or any other font websites that aren't slanted or stylized the way you like, when you could simply just italicize it in Photoshop. So now that we've got the font stylized and placed where we'd like, let's go ahead and create another layer, but let's just duplicate this layer with Ctrl J. Now with our move tool, let's just move that copied layer down a little bit underneath the original text. Now with Photoshop today, you have measurement tools so you can easily even it out right underneath the original text. Now you can repeat this process over and over again depending on how many text lines you'd like in your title, but the reason for doing this is to copy the style of the original text line and to keep it relevant with your font style. Now you can adjust this text to be bigger, smaller, the same size as the original text, and you can move it to certain areas to have a more visually appealing approach. Now, depending on what you'd like to do with this font, we can create a shape background. To do so, let's create another layer. Now, you could stylize the rectangle to be underneath all of your text, under certain points of your text, but since the 101 is smaller than the Rust Trolling font, we're going to want to give this a little tool to help it pop and stand out as well. So all we need to do with this layer is put it underneath the 101 layer. We're going to come over to our Shapes tool and make sure we have the rectangle selected. If not, just right click and find that rectangle. We're going to drag one right around the 101 text. We're going to want to come over to our paint bucket, our fill button, and we're going to want to fill in that rectangle. But since we had black in our color palette, we're going to need to change that color, and I recommend choosing something in your palette range or something relevant to the context of the video. But in this case, I'm going to select a color that matches the fire down here. Now you can always grab the text layer and use the measurement tools right on screen to make sure it's centered within your box. Now we can make the rectangle the actual 101 with a cutout, or we can leave the 101 over the rectangle. Now to do this effect easily, if you like to, just hit Control and select the T right next to your text layer. It's going to magic wand highlight all of the text. You can hit Control X to cut it, and you just made a cookie cutter. So all you have to do is hide the 101 layer, and depending on what you'd like, you can keep that font over the rectangle, you could delete it and make it look like a cutout, and if it seems a little bit hard to read, you can always come into the layer style and add a stroke. You could add some drop shadow as well, and all of this will avoid any visibility issues. And we're going to add a gradient overlay just to give it a little bit of a blanket contrasting effect. You could change the opacity, the color positioning, and when you're finished, you've got an overall more eye-catching rectangle. And of course, once the rectangle is completely done, we're going to want to make sure it's realigned with our text. And once you're happy with your rectangle, if you chose to do so, we can right-click the layer, we can rasterize the layer, and everything comes together as one block. Now, since the original text is much larger, we still want to edit this, but more is not always better. So for this text, we're just going to add a gradient overlay. make sure you choose a gradient style that differentiates itself from your background colors, or else everything is going to blend in too much. Also, make sure you update the opacity so you get the exact style you'd like. Now with this text, if we were to add stroke, you can see it's going to look quite ugly. So to make it stand out a little bit more in this left area, we're going to add a drop shadow. Now you can actually leave use global light on for every one of your images in your picture, and every single change you make is going to change for every item that has global light on. In this case, we don't have it on, so we can move that light positioning wherever we'd like. Once you have the opacity where you'd like and the light positioning set, you can mess around with the distance, the spread. If you want the shadow to look linear, leave the size low. If you want it to have a softer look with a more radial spread, increase the size. And once you've got it all where you like, hit OK. Now let's rasterize the layer in Rastrolling. Let's go ahead and select our rectangle and text layer with our shift. Let's merge them together. Let's move them into a final appropriate position. If you'd like to resize everything now that it's all linked, simply Ctrl T and move your text where you'd like it. If you'd like the edges of the photograph to keep that light effect around your text, you can leave everything as so, or if you'd like the lettering above it, just simply drag your new combined layer right above that light layer. And now that everything is combined, you can now create effects that will go across the entire combined image. So if you choose to create another drop shadow, or you want to include this ugly leaf pattern overlay, it'll affect everything in this merged image. So one last effect for the cherry on top. We're going to create one more layer. Let's drag it underneath our text and rectangle image, but still above the background. And also let's make sure it's below that edge light layer. We're going to come over to our brush tool and we're going to make sure the hardness is still at 0. But this time in your color palette, we're going to select something from the blue area here. Once we find a nice baby blue, we're going to go ahead and destroy all of the work we originally did and fill in the entire background. Now let's go ahead and go into effects and change the blend mode to overlay. Now let's bring the opacity down a bit, anywhere between 25 and 35. Let's click on our background image again and hit Ctrl and U. Let's change our saturation to about -10. Actually, I do want that drop shadow in there. There you go, you bitch. You're a lot sexier now, bitch. Now finally, for a little bit more contrast, we can add a border. So once again, make yourself a new layer. Let's select our gradient tool, select the whole image, open up the layer effects by double clicking, put your fill opacity all the way down to 0, come down to outer glow, change the size to about 120 pixels, come down to drop shadow. You might have to play around with the drop shadow to get it exactly how you'd like in this case. Hit OK and hit Ctrl T. Go to your border sides and drag out just a little bit for a line border. And once you hit your check mark, you're going to have a nice border around the entire image. You can also come into the layer style panels and adjust the color of this border and the opacity if you see fit. Let's bring it underneath our shape. And finally, let's put our shape evened out right underneath the border. And Bob's your uncle, you have a professional looking eye-catching thumbnail. Thank you, my sinners, for joining me for my Photoshop thumbnail creation tutorial. If you enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more tutorial videos, definitely hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, guys, definitely subscribe and hit that bell so you're always notified when any one of my new videos drops. And leave me a comment below, guys. What is the most frustrating aspect for you about learning to create thumbnails? Is it the design? Is it what font to use? What background to use? Let me know down below. Until next time, my sinners, thank you very much. Bye-bye.